On a dark autumn evening, Mark's phone rang. He picked up the receiver and heard the voice of his old acquaintance Jacob. "Hey, Mark," Jacob said enthusiastically. From the rest of the conversation, Mark understood that Jacob wanted to tell him about a place in the woods. Mark had been a marauder for many years. Although he had a good job in a security company, he still struggled to make ends meet after his wife's death, with 2 children to feed. When Mark's conversation with Jacob ended, he had all the information about an old cabin lost somewhere in the woods. Jacob asked for only 10% of what Mark would find there. Mark thought it was strange that Jacob didn't go himself and take everything that was there. Greed played its part, and the next day the marauder drove his pickup to the same woods. 3 hours later, he drove onto a bumpy forest road. It was starting to get light out. He got out of the car, took out his tools, backpack, and gun. Mark always carried his Glock 17, given to him by his wife when she was alive, as he could always run into trouble. He walked in the woods for about 2 hours. GPS showed that he was about 500 meters from the cabin, but he still couldn't see anything because of the dense trees. The weather suddenly changed. An hour ago when he entered the woods, it was sunny, but now clouds hung over his head and it seemed like it would rain any minute. He saw a clearing where a lonely cabin stood. The door was locked with an old rusty lock. He took out a small crowbar from his tool bag and ripped off the lock along with the hinges holding it on rusty nails. As he stepped inside, a musty smell hit his nose. He turned on his flashlight and walked into the room. Black and white photos hung on the walls, taken with an old camera when the whole family sat in front of the photographer and waited for the camera shutter to close. While inspecting the photos, he stumbled upon a small box. When he opened it, he saw antique gold coins and 2 gold rings. Jackpot, Mark thought, as he put the valuables into his backpack. After walking around the house for another 10 minutes, he found nothing else except a golden frame with a photo. He packed his things and left the cabin. And then everything around him seemed to change. The trees that were once straight became distorted, and it was already evening outside, although he had spent about 30 minutes in the cabin. He took out his GPS navigator, but there was no signal. He walked in what seemed to be the right direction, but realized that he wouldn't make it to his car before dark, and he had no desire to search for it with a flashlight in the dark forest without GPS. Returning to the cabin, he threw his backpack by the fireplace and collapsed onto the old worn-out bed. Mark quickly fell asleep. He dreamed of his youngest daughter, who was now staying with her grandmother. And then he suddenly heard a disgusting screeching sound as if someone was running a file across a metal sheet. His eyes opened and he jumped up. Looking around, he didn't see anything that could seem strange. But then a quiet voice echoed throughout the house. "He's here," said an unknown person. Mark panicked, frantically leaping towards the fireplace to grab his Glock from his backpack. However, in the darkness, he couldn't find his backpack, or it wasn't there at all. Then he felt someone's gaze on him, his heart beating wildly. But he couldn't get up and run. Fear had paralyzed him. The silhouette standing in the doorway, looking nothing like a human, stared at him with glowing red eyes. Mark snapped out of his paralysis for a second and ran towards the door, breaking through the abomination standing in the doorway. He flew out of the cabin, then a loud whisper echoed throughout the forest. "He's here!" Mark ran, and ran. It was starting to get light outside, and after a couple of hours he managed to reach the road. He remembered this road, and after a while, he was able to reach his pickup truck. "I need to get out of here as fast as possible," he thought. 3 hours later, he was home. The kids were still at their grandmother's house. Mark took out a bottle of brandy from the cupboard. His hands were still shaking badly. After drinking half the bottle, he remembered Jacob. "You bastard, you're going to pay for everything now," Mark muttered, grabbing the home phone since his mobile was still in his backpack. He dialed Jacob's number from the phone book. His wife answered the phone. "Mark," she asked. "Get that bastard Jacob on the phone," Mark shouted. "Who?" the woman said, confused. "Jacob, his motherfucking Jacob," Mark said. "Mark, he died 3 months ago. I didn't want to bother you with yet another funeral, especially since you haven't recovered from your wife's death yet. That's why I didn't tell you." "You haven't talked in a long time," the woman said. Mark ripped the cord out of the phone. He stood there in shock and had no idea what he had seen that night or who had called him the day before.